one plunges the mind with all of its habits, with all of its craziness, into the heart of that blazing field, so that the separations, the clinging, the grasping that the mind is capable of are burned away.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. Today, we are diving deep into contemplative mysticism with David Chaim Smith. David Chaim Smith is no stranger to Glitch Bottle. He is a contemplative mystic, an esoteric cartographer, and author. His life's work as a contemplative mystic is to unravel the habit fields of the mind by bathing in the fiery love of the divine. And David says that this is something that all of us right now can do in the midst of anything we experience in life, in joy, pain, any mind state at all. This is the exact portal that unravels our conceptuality and allows us to directly experience what is already the case. David shares in this show his powerful insights about what contemplative mysticism is, but also how it differs from other esoteric practices. So now, let's welcome back to the podcast, David Chaim Smith. David Chaim Smith, thank you so much for returning on the Glitch Bottle podcast today. A fundamental question, something that gets, I think, to the root of everything that you do is, David, what is the path of mystical contemplation?
Wow, what a great question. So glad that you asked that. The path of mystical contemplation is so much simpler than people might believe. And in a very crude sense, we could say that it's just basically acting upon the impulse to love the divine. And when I use a term like that, everybody has complete saturation with all the associations for their entire lives that they've had on what they think that means. But I approach this great love and immersion into this love without falling into one of two basic categories. And the first category is the category of theism, which is the view held by those who uphold a first cause for creative activity and phenomena, which is a supreme being, a creator God of some sort. In all its shapes and forms, in all iterations of theology, one could say that whether it's a monad or whether it's a separate creator God dualistically creating the universe or anything in between, you're talking about a first cause. And you're solidifying that into a mental construct. You believe that a supreme intelligence underlies creative activity. That's theism. When it's applied to some branch of the creative process and can be visualized and given a name in a polytheistic way, still the same impulse. You're reifying a source, a cause of the effects of creation. That's theism in a nutshell. And when you look at all of the magicians who listen to your show, whether they be from traditions coming out of grimoires or Solomonic magic or even early Hellenistic forms or Golden Dawn or whatever, so many of them are using divine names, names of God from religious traditions. What does that mean to them? Well, this is really the fundamental question. What is their view of this ground of causation that they're naming? So that has to be examined. On the flip side, you have those who deny a supreme cause, atheists as opposed to theists. And this is the view that is held by most contemporary science and is taught in universities, and basically takes a contrary position to saying that this hidden first cause that we can't point to or see or touch or experience directly is not true. And therefore, what is true are the laws of causation itself as mechanical processes, even processes that transcend mechanics into the quantum area. And this becomes the secular view of atheism, that the creative processes are studied and an attempt is made to try to understand them, but some hidden first cause is denied. So what I'm doing, having said all of that, what I'm doing is neither of those two things. I am neither honoring a first cause or denying a first cause. What I am doing is pointing to the mystery itself and immersing the mind in the love of the mystery itself, which is ever present throughout whatever arises. And this is referred to by a great many names. In a philosophical sense, you could say it's the ground of phenomena, the basis of phenomena, or its essence, the essence of reality. And I am not reifying it into a God that is a first cause, because personally, I don't look at causal relationships as related to this ground. I think it transcends causal chains and transcends linear relationships of causes and effects. So you take away the first cause and you just deal with it as the ever-present essence of everything, but yet in its ungraspability, it is in and of itself like a nothingness. It can't be reduced to anything that you could point to and say it is this. Even a monad is insufficient, right? So if I'm not looking at it theistically, I am also not looking at it atheistically. Meaning I'm not denying, I'm not placing my chips either on the is or is not God question. So I am looking at the essence of reality, which my tradition, which is the tradition of Kabbalah, refers to as En Sof. En meaning no, Sof meaning limit or end. Without end, without limit. The infinite. And the ground of En Sof, this open fullness, exudes its own luminosity spontaneously. It doesn't step down to issue the light forth like theists would believe. It spontaneously glows with pure possibility. And that glow of possibility crackles through all form, all idea, what we refer to as the passage of time in the activities of processes changing and in the kaleidoscopic array of possible sensations that the human nervous system can engage with. This magical entity is like its lifeblood, you could say, its atmosphere. So the essence of reality is faced directly through love, through loving it, through being concerned with it, through caring about it, without reifying it into a cause that either is or is not. So once we take all that stuff off the table, what are we left with? Well, if you love it, and I'm calling it an it here, even though it is most certainly not reducible to an it thing. So if you love it, the one thing that I can say about it, which is a position which asserts a certain point of view, is that it is inherently beneficent. So it's a nothingness. You can't grasp it. It's ungraspable, but yet it's inherently good. And what do I base this assertion of goodness upon? Just simply the fact that it appears, that it produces phenomena, that phenomena arises. So phenomena arises, and we might like it, we might not like it. As a matter of fact, what we take as our existence is subjected to 100% assurance of pain and suffering and inevitable death. So the horror of the world is included in what I'm calling the fundamental goodness by virtue of the fact that it appears. Possibility appears as an array of displayed virtues, of the full spectrum of options. We might like it and feel good. We might not like it and feel bad. That's not the issue. So this goes back to this theism versus atheism question. I'm not taking either of those two positions because I believe that they're asking the wrong question. The same thing is true about liking phenomena or not liking phenomena. From the mystical contemplative standpoint, that's asking the wrong question. So a mystical contemplative is interested in immersion into the essence of reality beyond what we think and feel about it, positions that we could take about it, either asserting its existence or non-existence. So what does the contemplative mystic do? The contemplative mystic immerses in the essence of reality to the extent that they can through techniques, and we'll go over what that means, and becomes interested in the pure essence of possibility outside of any conception that the mind might form about it. All that is irrelevant. And the way that we do this is by caring about it, by loving it. A theist would say to love God. I don't know what an atheist would say because I don't think that they really have an equivalent of that. So in a sense, I'm with the religious people on the love of the divine, even though I don't believe in a God or one of many gods. But by the same standpoint, I'm a non-theist because when you pray and you call out to God, there's nobody listening. There's nobody up there. I've tried to go up there. There's nobody there. Listen, if I believe in him, the God figure, then I believe in me, a separate being who approaches the God figure. And I believe in neither one. My own personal separate autonomy is just a display. The essence is a wholeness. It's not separable. It's not reducible. It's not definitively fragmentary. Its wholeness is beyond the mind's capacity to apprehend. It is the mysterium tremendum. It's the great mystery.
So, David, you said earlier that your tradition is a tradition of Kabbalah. And playing devil's advocate here, we probably have many listeners who are saying, well, wait a second. I know about the Kabbalistic tree of life, and it's all about emanationism. It's all about Keter becomes Chokmah, Binah, you have Chesed and Gevurah, all the way down to our Malkuthian coil that we find ourselves on. So what would your response be to someone who's listening and saying, well, wait a second, I thought Kabbalah, as I understand it, was all about the emanation of the spheres and God kind of descending down, divinity descending down into materiality. What would you say to that?
I would say that the most common view that Kabbalists have, and I'm talking about both in the Hebrew and Hermetic camps of Kabbalah. Your listeners probably would be much more familiar with Hermetic Kabbalah, right, which is the underlying structure in the Solomonic grimoires. I mean, where did those divine names come from that all those seals and angels correspond to? It came from Renaissance Hermetic Kabbalah. All of that stuff really comes out of a kind of a reductionistic take on Neoplatonism, where you really have a monist system that steps down in levels. And each of those levels decreases in its subtlety, in its proximity or its closeness to its source. So you have an unknowable source that steps down one level, the next level, the next level, and each one diminishes or reduces itself and becomes more opaque or solid seeming until you reach the bottom. This latter system is the common one. And this is not the view that I hold. And the only thing I could say about that approach is that's what the conventional habits of the mind are already doing. So it's a mainstream approach because it appeals to conventional perception. The mind wants to reduce its information to bits that are assembled in networks, so it can make sense of pieces of information and bind them together with other pieces of information to form circuits that can be communicated. So the standard, conventional, communicative, discursive way that the mind works is linear, is fragmentary. It focuses on one bit of information at a time, and then those bits are organized hierarchically. So somebody who approaches Kabbalah like that, if they're a strict linear emanationist, they haven't made a break with the ordinary conventional habits of the mind. They've just created an esoteric system out of their conventionality. Now, what I'm doing uses the same symbol system that they are. The same language, the same tree of Sphirot, the same context, the same letters, all that stuff. However, I look at it as a radical state of wholeness in which, for example, using what you said, the Malkut display is not seen and understood and grasped as a byproduct or an end function, an effect of a series of causal relationships that were ushered from a cause of that effect that is far away, as if that faraway cause had to go through a vast machinery of step-down reductions to produce this byproduct, which is a world that we see as coherent. My view is to take this display for the wholeness itself and say that its essentiality is inherent in the display and is the display in its act of expressing itself. Therefore, I see no essential difference whatsoever between Malkut and En Sof. The only difference that could arise is the degree of transparency of all of those possible steps and stages where the mind could solidify its pieces and veer into its habits to create the appearance of a separation between a cause and the effect. If I'm saying flat out from the beginning, there is no separation between what emanationists would call the ultimate source and the ultimate effect of that source becoming reality. If I'm saying that there is nothing separating the two, that they are actually the same, the only question that remains is how are the habits of my own mind separating them? And if we look at the habits, the conventional habits that create those separations, we have an actual path, because the activity of the mind doing that, creating that reductionistic separation, on the path of contemplative mysticism is brought from that state of opacity, that fragmentary opacity, into a state of transparency, in which the inherent essence of reality can shine through and be apprehended as the flesh of the divine, which is inherent in all things. It's the chair that I'm sitting on. It's the air that I'm breathing. It's my own perceptivity in knowing it. So it's both what knows which is consciousness, and what becomes known, which is the context in which consciousness engages its objects. So the goal of the work of contemplative mysticism, which is called gnosis, taken from the Greek, so obviously I'm talking from the standpoint of a Hermetic Kabbalist. A Hebrew Kabbalist would say Ruach HaKodesh instead of gnosis. But the goal of the work is the realization of that essentiality through all phenomena. And the form of contemplative mysticism that I'm involved with comes through loving it. It's a devotional form of contemplation. So it's fiery in its devotion. It's not analytical and cold. It's fiery. And one plunges the mind with all of its habits, with all of its craziness, into the heart of that blazing field, so that the separations, the clinging, the grasping that the mind is capable of are burned away like a rocket in re-entry back to the earth, which becomes, the Garden of Eden if it is truly realized. So the goal of the work, the gnosis of the work, is loving that beneficent nothingness to the point that everything that would separate it or obscure it or obstruct it is burned away, is consumed on contact. Hallelujah.
David, another devil's advocate question. Someone out there might be listening and saying, this sounds amazing. This sounds like a wonderful practice. But how do you reconcile, or how do I practice this when there is challenges in my life, death, misery, illness, family conflict, migraines, pain, suffering? How can I love the divine? How can I have this, neither this nor that, neither confirming nor denying, almost Sufistic love of al-hub, or love, when there's all this pain and suffering in the world? What would you say to someone?
I would say you can count on the pain and suffering. I don't think that that's an exception. That is the rule. So we're talking about ourselves here. No human being escaping that. So let's just assume that we're not talking about some person. We're talking about us. So what do we do? What do I do? What do you do? Well, this is why it's a difficult path, because the average person is going to be so consumed with their concerns for moment-to-moment circumstance that they're not going to have the interest or the wherewithal to sustain a real bond with this beneficent essentiality in their lives. They just simply won't care. They've got other things to do, and that's fine. That's for them to work out. However, those freaks, those weirdos, those outcasts like myself, who somehow, through some configuration of their mind and their heart, I don't know how it got that way, it just got that way. We can't turn away. We're going to experience the suffering. But at the heart of that suffering is still the same question, the same damn question. What is this? What is its essence while I'm suffering? You ask that question while you're suffering. You ask that question while you're experiencing pleasure. You ask that question while you're experiencing boredom. You ask that question while you're distracted with the intricacies of whatever the hell you're doing. It doesn't matter. If that question is so poignant, and if it is burning so bright that your mind keeps coming back to it again and again and again, no matter what it's doing, then chances are you might be a candidate for this crazy path, which is insane. Because, and I say that with all due respect. Somebody once told me that when anybody uses the term with all due respect, you could pretty much guarantee that they're going to say something disrespectful.
No, 100%. Yes.
So it is disrespectful to, in a sense, to those who are taking their suffering so seriously. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't, but what I'm saying is that when nothing else really matters but this question of binding to the essence of reality, which is what it's all about, when that outshines everything else, you're no longer doing practical worldly work. So since contemplative mysticism doesn't make you a more productive member of the workforce, since it doesn't increase the likelihood of success in your chosen area or whatever kind of worldly goal, it doesn't benefit worldly stuff really at all, then what you're doing by the standards of the world is crazy. And somebody like myself is dedicated to that insanity. Now, we'll talk about magic after we talk about the path, because I never talk about magic in my books. Obviously, I have been doing magic all my life and continue to do so in various forms. But it's an outgrowth of the relationship with the essentiality that is the paramount thing and is what I talk about in my books and what I'm talking to you about now, because it is only from the realization of that view that the world becomes magical. And if so-called ordinary things can be seen as magical, you could shape them or reshape them through magical processes. If you look at the world as ordinary, how the hell is magic supposed to work? So looking at the world as evidence of magic in action, that's the thing. All right. So I'd love to talk to you about the actual path. You said, what do you do? And I gave you this long-winded, bloviation. And now let's talk about what you actually do. Well, simple answers are best here. So let's look at a series of points that could describe the path. And I'm trying to say it in the simplest way that I can, because this is what eludes people. This is what confuses people once the highfalutin verbiage starts getting spread like rancid butter on a piece of old toast. We're starting this process in a way that seems antithetical to the view that I'm expounding. Because when I talk about love of the divine and immersion into the fire of devotion, that's a non-conceptual virtue that is cultivated over the course of the path. When the mind creates these hierarchies that divide levels of reduction in the stepladder system, the emanationist view of a source engaged in causal expression from level to level to level, just like we said, so that Malkut is at the end and it's dumb and stupid and opaque and just lays there like the proverbial turd in the punch bowl. Okay, when that happens, what's at fault is the mind's capacity to reduce phenomena to seemingly solid pieces. That's conceptuality. The same reductionism that makes a thought or a sense perception or a feeling or an emotion seem like itself, so that you could define it and say what it is, and then you put a word label on it. That process of reductionism is conceptuality in action, and it has many levels of subtlety and can be extremely subtle, so that you could conceptually reify, for example, etheric impulses and basically do with them what you do with everything else, which is reduce them to bits, to pieces, in this fragmented chaos of the so-called plane of Malkut. But if we take our plane of Malkut as evidence of Ein Sof in action and seek to realize it through the transparency of things, what we are seeking to do is know it non-conceptually. That's very important. However, having said that, we have to start with conceptuality on the path by learning, by studying, by understanding why we're doing what we're doing. You have to learn conceptually about the virtues of sublime essentiality in order to realize it and act upon that quest for realization while you live your life. You're not going to be able to contemplate unless you know what you're contemplating. And that's extremely important because the preliminary study, the conceptual study of the system, is the basis for the intention that you're going to have, so that you know what you're setting out to do and you can actually pursue it. But that's not the only reason why we engage conceptuality as part of the path in the early stages or the preliminary stages. There's a far more misunderstood, bizarre reason. And when you look at my books, all right, there's a lot of esoteric information bandied about, equations and geometric relationships and symbol play and explanations that seem philosophical. It ain't philosophy, but it seems philosophical. And now I'm talking about non-conceptuality, what gives, right? The reality is that in order to immerse in the path, you have to change your mind, make it different. And one way that while you're building this conceptual foundation for the work, that you could change your mind is by taking the impulse of conceptuality and inflating it or exaggerating it. Like when you read one of my books, especially some of the really dense ones, it's like you're running the mind through this obstacle course, this mental obstacle course that builds its muscles in an unnatural way. And there's not a lot of people who are going to sit still for such a thing. But like I said before, you get those freaks, those weirdos, those outcasts who will say, this is for me, But then again, you get people who say, this is for me about a bunch of really weird stuff in the world. This is just one of those weird things. So if this style of practice appeals to you for whatever reason, you learn the symbol system and you follow these obstacle courses, and at the same time, the sense of conceptuality is getting overinflated. And what is induced is a state of hyperfluidity of your conceptual facility. Now, on the tree of life, I don't want to throw in too much Kabbalah to alienate your audience, but the impulse for conceptuality is presented on the tree by the quasi-sphera of dot. Sefer Yetzirah says 10 and not 9, 10 and not 11. There are 10 sphirot, but there's this 11th sphera, which is asserted at a certain strategic point on the tree that represents sort of the summation of what is building that can then be released into the three supernal sphirot, and that's dot. Ultimately, and without getting into too much detail, what happens in the path is you inflate that dot and you build it up until it becomes so muscle-bound, so full, so fluid that it becomes almost monstrous. And that conceptual monstrosity is then released and surrendered and utterly and completely absorbed by the Keter, by the highest sphera, thereby transforming through its sacrifice and the fire of its consumption, the restrictive impulse within Keter, which is the ordinary one, and transmutes those restrictive forces to a transparency, so that the ground of Ein Sof can shine through unencumbered by the skins or the shells, the klipot of the conceptual mind. So the goal of the work is this surrender. However, we got to know what we're doing, number one, and then we have to have the wherewithal to be able to do it, number two, and that is where the hyperfluidity of conceptuality is important. So while that's happening, that we're building by contemplating symbol play through these exaggerated conceptual monuments that we're building, at the same time, we're raising a tremendous amount of life force. because it takes a lot of life force to do what I'm talking about. And that's the alchemical fire. That's the catalyst for the transformation. The more fiery it becomes, because let's face it, no one is going to go through these mental obstacle courses unless there's a tremendous amount of fiery life force there. It would just be too boring. You got to be motivated on some unknowable level, and how that happens is a total mystery. It comes from the person. It comes from their disposition. If someone is that type of person, just the symbols will evoke that kind of fire just by being interested in them. But at the same time that you're raising life force with this hyperfluidity that you're cultivating, you're also raising what I call imaginal power, the power of the mind to picture its circumstance in investigation, in discovery, which is the power that the mind uses when it creates pictures in the imagination. This is the power of the mind's capacity for vision. And that power, that imaginal power, is literally the capacity to reshape phenomena, is literally the capacity to perceive reality and then reshape reality into another form. So when you combine these two impulses, the impulse for raising life force and the impulse to raise imaginal power, you've got two aspects of the same thing. You've got the fire of a catalyst for alchemical operation, and then you have the actual subject of the alchemical transformation, the alchemical mercury, the mind itself. In other words, you're evoking the mind and its capacity to work. And of course, these have correspondences on the tree, and that gets into an esoteric area. But once you go through the preliminary stage of learning and studying, and this hyperfluidity that I'm talking about is cultivated, and it raises this life force and this imaginal power, something really bizarre happens. And most people don't even get to this level. But I would venture to guess that a huge swath of your audience, as soon as I say these words, will know exactly what I'm talking about. And that is that at a certain point, consciousness starts to recognize itself. Thinking can think about the fact that it's thinking. Knowing can know the fact that it's knowing. Rather than just functioning robotically, mechanically, which is what conceptuality leads you to do. You can't conceptualize your way into a direct interface with the mind itself. If the mind conceptualizes about itself, what does it get? It gets another thought. That's not the mind itself. That's a thought about the mind. Right? So when the mind is introduced to itself, it is not through ordinary processes of thinking and feeling that it confronts that mystery. When consciousness recognizes itself, this is the beginning of what I call the lightning flash. It tears through the networks of associative patterns. It tears through the thoughts and feelings about what is happening, which is a separation, which is a sort of an approximating process. When the lightning flash tears through all the structures that we've depended upon throughout our whole life to try to know what's going on, the mind is utterly astounded, shocked, almost traumatized, we could say. And through that astonishment, the astonishment of that wondrousness, which cannot be described or communicated, right? When consciousness recognizes itself, which comes about through an instant, boom, and then it's gone. Then we start thinking and feeling again, right? But in the moment that that spark breaks forth, that's the supernova, that's the door that opens to essentiality. And that's when you can start to explore in a totally new way, because that beneficent nothingness, that essentiality that we love, and here's the great mystery that everybody has heard a million times, and I'll say it again. That essential mystery is inherently conscious. So Ein Sof is the essence of your own mind. It is not separate from your own mind. I'm not saying it's the same as your conceptual thinking and feeling, because those are just reductionistic patterns that you're hiding within. They're garments, they're hiding places. But the consciousness of consciousness, which we call pure awareness, which has no form, it's not consciousness doing anything. It is just simply the perceptivity of being aware, the wakefulness of it. That is in and of itself the self-glow of Ein Sof. That is the divine that lives in the heart of all things. When it realizes itself through you, the practitioner, sparks of gnosis are realized.
Okay, if this is the path, if this is how you love reality and have that love for the divine, can you trace out how does this differ from, say, mainstream occultism?
Well, I think in mainstream occultism, when people ask themselves what is it that they're really actually interested in, a lot of the time it would be changing circumstances. I want this circumstance to be different. I want the result of circumstance to be different. I want the power, the glory, the this, the that, whatever quality they like, to get away from the qualities that they don't like. That's one point of view. But what I'm saying is that if you're not so much concerned with the circumstances, with the conditions, whatever they might be, good, bad, or indifferent, and really what you're falling in love with is the unconditioned essence of all of those circumstances. If that's what's exciting you, well, that's a pretty big difference right there. And that will produce an entirely different view. So if you're saying, how does it differ from mainstream occultism? I think that anybody listening to this can ask themselves a question, what is it that I'm really interested in? And if it's the unconditioned essence of all circumstances, well, then you're really in a minority, because the majority of occultists are interested in powers of various types, qualities of various types, achieving this, manipulating that, which is fine, because all of that fits in to a very broad and complex subject. My part of that subject is in this area of realizing and loving essentiality, and that is a very specific thing. To become a contemplative mystic, devotional contemplative mystic, it's very specific. So I'm not trying to say that the other viewpoints are wrong or bad or are sidetracks or anything like that. I'm just saying that what I'm doing comes at this endeavor from a very specific standpoint. So the intention, that's one way. I'd say when you get a little bit more specific, the mainstream view of occultism tends to be how rigidly you adhere to that ladder concept, that emanationist ladder concept, which is always expressed from the conventional point of view as either an upward or a downward reductionism. In other words, I'm climbing up the ladder and I'm placing myself in each of the rungs as I ascend. And by the same token, reality has manifested through those rungs of the ladder in a downward descent, which has reduced itself to each plane or each position or each level or layer. And whether you're talking about the upward or the downward reductionism, what you're really talking about is a view based on linear coordinate placements, that you place reality in a slot, in a ladder system, rather than always be concerned with the wholeness of the expanse of. I'm not saying that the levels do not appear. Of course they do. Of course, all of the layers and levels appear. All of the worlds appear. And all of the beings in all of the worlds that populate them and all of their activities, of course, appear. But what is the essence? What is the blood that is flowing through that body, the wholeness of that body? That's a very different concern than constantly referring back to this linear coordinate placement. Because if you're stuck on this linear coordinate placement idea, then you'll know this when you hear people's language. They'll talk about, oh, well, here in the Malkut level, which is the ordinary world. When people say things like that, what they're implying is that they're somehow going to leave the Malkut and transcend it and go up to Yesod or Hod and Netzach and, rise up beyond this mundane world. What I'm saying is totally different. What I'm saying is you never leave the Malkut, because no matter how subtle the inquiry gets, it's that Malkut display that is realized in Keter. That ultimately, what you're realizing in Keter is reality itself, the Malkut itself. What is the nature of this display? If I looked at it as just a step on a ladder to go over, then this world would be meaningless. And we would just seek to escape from it or transcend it in some way. Leaving it behind is just like, the byproduct or the excrement of the divine creative process. Is the world around you the excrement of the divine creative process, Alex? If you have that view, that's what I would call quite negative.
Some people out there might be thinking, I really want to practice this love of the divine. You've written dozens of books. You have online courses, everything we'll, of course, link to below. But how would you recommend, David, someone listening to begin that process of loving the divine?
Inquiring through study and consideration the question of what's really important in your life. And if you don't know, which I think is really a very fine answer, when you ask what's actually most important in your life and you say, I don't know, then you take it incumbent upon you to find out, to look at various points of view of what's really important and consider them. Because if somebody says something that seems very amorphous, like the essence of reality is and so, well, what the hell does that mean? So you find out. And in the process of finding out, if something grabs you, like deeply grabs you, then you throw yourself into that inquiry until it hits a wall. Right? And the wall could be, I no longer believe this because. And then you investigate the because and you make your decision. But if you look, for example, at mystical texts, and for me, people have a very weird idea of what they think that I do. People think I'm some sort of like renegade Jew or something. And really the most important texts to me are so outsider. They're so odd in the traditions. Like, for example, the Kabbalah that I practice is really an amalgam of a 13th century school of inquiry called the Iyun school. And its main text is the Fountain of Wisdom, but there's supplementary texts that go along with that. And the tradition of devotional Kabbalah from mostly the 18th century, which are certain forms of Hasidus or Hasidic Kabbalah. It doesn't mean that I'm a Hasid or an Orthodox Jew, which I am not. And it doesn't mean that I'm a 13th century, whatever those guys were. I'm not a scholar. I don't know what they did in the 13th century. But the main texts for me are these Hasidic Kabbalistic texts, these contemplative mystical texts from very early Kabbalah, combined with certain schools of Christian mysticism that really falls into what they would call the apophatic category. And the two prominent texts for me are the works of Pseudo-Dionysius and an anonymous text from the 14th century called The Cloud of Unknowing. So when you take, for example, certain really special works of Hasidic Kabbalah, like Likutei Moharan by Rebbe Nachman of Breslov, what he's saying on an essential level is so much like the cloud of unknowing that you have to be able to put them together. If you're an Orthodox Jew or you're a Christian, you won't be able to do that. But if you're a contemplative mystic and you don't care about religion, for the most part, of course you could put them together. You could do anything you want with these things, including ignore religious references as not relevant to you. So when I read Cloud of Unknowing, doesn't mean I'm a Christian. When I read Likutei Moharan, it doesn't mean I'm an Orthodox Jew. Fuck that. Really, what I'm talking about here is looking for something very specific and odd, that if you have the wherewithal or the impulse to be interested in it, you seek it out. You seek it out at all costs, no matter what other people tell you is right or wrong, or the right way, the correct way, the path to God. Don't listen to those people. Don't listen to me. Listen to your own damn heart and follow it. And what you love will determine what you are.
Listeners, I hope you appreciated this as much as I do. David's work is absolutely a call for each of us, and I know myself for sure, to declare a spiritual war on the habit fields of our minds, to declare it on our scattered attention, to reclaim that, and to start practicing ways to kindle that blazing love of the divine in literally whatever appears. So please check out the links below to order your copy of David's works, and also check out his online courses and so much more. Also, definitely, if you'd like to become a supporter of Glitchbottle, check us out at patreon.com/glitchbottle for exclusive updates, as well as chatting and everything in between. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.